Hello, everyone. Welcome to our very first episode. My name is Chen. I'm a cultural historian of early medieval Europe and late medieval China. I'm based in Austin, Texas, United States of America. So today, my partner Ron and I are discussing some key ideas about Giambattista Vico, the eminent philosopher, historian, and jurist of the Italian Enlightenment. Hi, Ron.
Hey, Tren. I'm Oran, and I am a teacher of philosophy, and I focus on the German philosophy of the 19th and 20th century, and I'm based in Austin as well.
Oh, what a coincidence. Yes. So today we'll first introduce the book we're reading, then provide a shorter biographical sketch of Vico, then we'll dive into his ideas. All right. So Ron and I read a book titled Three Critiques of the Enlightenment, Vico, Hamann, and Herder. Spoiler alert, so this book covers the ideas of the three thinkers, Giambattista Vico, Johann Georg Hamann, and Johann Gottfried Herder. So this book is an edited volume of different sketches, lectures, and even tape recording of the British historian of ideas, Isaiah Berlin, edited by Henry Hardy. And okay, so much for the bibliographical info. Let's move on to Vico's life, shall we? So Vico was born in 1668 and died in 1744. For almost his entire life, he did not leave his native city, Naples, then the political center of the Kingdom of Naples. So in this very heavily clerical and Catholic polity, Vico received a traditional, conventional education that is focused on Aristotelian logic and scholastic training. However, through his own reading, especially after the year 1700, on the humanists and jurists such as Hugo Grotius, Vico's idea started to get very much in line with, and in fact anticipated the later on Enlightenment concern about the valid approach towards the human knowledge, and especially the universal and the particular relationship. Though at the times Vico received patronage from powerful political leaders, he struggled financially all his life, to the extent that he could only afford to publish a quarter of his magnum opus, New Science. That is the source Isaiah Berlin relied heavily on. Vico published this truncated version in the 1720s. And during his writing and thinking, he had to do all kinds of part-time jobs, so to speak, including collecting and editing Latin inscriptions, and worked as a rhetoric tutor. So I think personally, like the fact that Vico focused so much on language and cultural expression was very much informed by his life experience, like working with the language and made his living through languages. One final point before going to his main ideas, Vico was a pious Catholic, and he either subconsciously or carefully excluded human knowledge received from divine revelation from his discussion, in terms of using cultural historical method to criticize a timeless approach towards towards truth or human understanding of the world. So that's for the biographical background. Shall we jump into our
Of course.
discussion of key ideas? Yes, please.
So we could start with one of the main distinctions that Berlin talks about in reference to Vico's thought. And that distinction is between the concept of certum and verum. And of course, there are many subtleties in the distinction that is made by Vico there. But basically what makes the distinction super interesting is in the proposition that Vico provides that basically equates verum with factum, which means that the true and the made are convertible. So what is happening here is, and what is happening at the core of this distinction, is the distinction that Vico wants to make between the knowledge of what we humans have made and the knowledge of the stuff that we are merely the subject of. And what Vico is directing us to is that no matter how much you know something that you haven't made, you can never really know that thing. And this point could be directed at many disciplines of knowledge. Like, for instance, the natural facts of existence. We haven't decided on how our brain works chemically. And the chemistry of the neurons is something that is not a human invention, but it's something that we just happen to have. And I doubt that Vico would ever doubt that we could get into the details of the science of chemistry. The science of chemistry could 100% be present as a legitimate object of science, but there is a chasm of difference between the scientific understanding of the brain versus a sense of understanding of a friend or a work of art, or as Isaiah Berlin makes it vivid, knowing an entire civilization or a joke, to know what it is to be poor, to be jealous, to be a lover, a convert, a traitor. All of those examples, I may not be a convert myself, but when someone talks about their conversion, there is something about that act that comes from being this specific type of entity that is not accessible to, say, squirrels to know what convert means. Even if I don't come up with a joke or laugh at a joke, I can get a sense of what a joke is. And that establishes a very unique relationship between me and something like a joke, that I can never have that relationship with the chemicals of my neurology, the chemistry of my brain. There is a fundamental distinction between these two. Now, Vico is not as much interested in jokes or conversion, but he is interested in something like history. And history is something that makes sense from the perspective of human beings. Like, it is something that we have created in a way. The way that we have been the authors of history, according to Vico, is not comparable to our natural history, that we haven't been an author of it at all. Like, we haven't had any role in deciding how kidneys work. That happens to be just like a natural fact that there is. So this distinction basically wants to emphasize the difference between the knowledge of what we have made and knowledge of what we have nothing to do when it comes to the question of creation. And only the intimacy of creation could give access to genuine knowledge of a level that is completely different from knowledge of something that is just merely given or external to us.
I think before we go to history and whether human beings are the writer of their history stuff, I think one good way to think about the distinction between sentient and verum, and at least that's the analogy I thought of when I was trying to make sense of what Vic was trying to say, is let's think about piece of artwork. I can go into a gallery and appreciate oil painting without being a painter myself. But Vico would say, my understanding, my appreciation of the beauty conveyed through that, say, symbolic artwork is categorically, well, it's interesting. It's very different from the painter who actually paints such work. However, the subtlety here is because that person, the artist and I are both human beings, there is some really robust and implicit conduit, some possibility of a communication that enable me to somehow imagine such art producing process. So here's a matter of, I think, in my reading at least, about potentiality and the really the real comprehension. So it's a distinction between the known and the knowable. So go back to what you said about history. There is, in my reading, very interesting and not very explicit or clear distinction between so-called natural history and human history. I think that parallels his Vico's idea, but the distinction between human sciences and natural sciences. And as you said, we are not creators. We human beings are not the creators of, say, a squirrel or Earth as a planet, whatever, because in his worldview, God alone is. Therefore, our understanding of the, say, natural environment, things that are not human, external to us, is in the realm of certum. We're trying to ascertain certain patterns, properties based on our empirical observation and some deductive logic or reasoning. But by switching our subjective inquiry from this external to the human realm, we are actually pursuing a different form of knowledge to a certain extent. It's called self-knowledge, I suppose. He doesn't use that term, but I think, yes, we can further elaborate that, but I think for the moment, for that realm, he postulates, I think, two really interesting things, and indeed radical for his time. First is there is a new approach towards such knowledge, because the accepted means of human knowledge at his time included the following: a priori logic, a posteriori empirical observation, yada yada. But he added something called fantasia, which is probably the best way to render into English is reconstructive imagination. So, and that very neatly corresponds with what later counter-Enlightenment thinkers proposed as Anfühlen, to empathize with, by the fact that we are human beings like me and that painter, even though I do not paint, but I could empathize with his or her urge or feeling while communicate through some physical medium to other fellow human beings. That's one part. The other is, gosh, what's the other point I'm trying to make?
Can I jump into the first
yes.
part before you remember that?
Yes.
I think the term of the robust possibility of communication is fascinating there, because I think that's exactly what is going on. Even if I'm not the painter, even if I'm not able to paint what that painter painted, right? Even if I think it would be clear for Vico or any of these figures that any Anfühlen, any sort of empathy, is a matter of approximation. I can never know what exactly you feel or how that specific accident traumatized you, but I I know enough to be able to communicate. I know enough to be part of that game of connection that is impossible to establish with a wolf. That kind of a connection is not going to be possible at that level with an algae, right? It's not something that could be established. And history comes to the picture here because it's not just we are the creators in a very naive sense, but it is our product. It's not that I am writing it myself. And the fact that we all are contributing to this process of unfoldment of history. History makes sense because we are part of it. It doesn't have any sort of external existence outside us. The same type of relationship could exist. We could communicate with history at the level that we cannot communicate with the natural world, at least from where Vico is coming from. And when I was mentioning natural history, that might have been a confusing term. I meant more, of course, Vico didn't know anything about this, but like evolution. Like natural history in the sense that they've been evolving. I don't think Vico, or from a Vicoian perspective, we can communicate, quote unquote, communicate with our evolutionary past the way that we could communicate with our human-made history.
Yeah. I'm glad that you jumped in, because that really first reminds me of the forgotten second point, which is precisely about his historical approach. And I'll come back to your point on evolution. I think it's very interesting. I think, of course, in his time, the evolution of a species, that kind of natural historical approach or scientific approach, hasn't yet been established. But I think his writing has a strong potential to, well, in fact, some may argue, provides a proto-theory of cultural evolution. So, which, yes, let me go to his historical method first. So the closest contemporary term in academia I can think of for his approach towards historical interpretations, perhaps history of mentalities, with a strong focus on philology, that Vico interprets social change in the sense that human beings, of course, are not deciding the trajectory of human history alone. There are many other natural contingencies, because we are not the ultimate writer of human history or natural history. Only the providence, the invisible hand from the God, his worldview was that. But human beings have played a very unique and important part in the unfolding of the providence, because God's creation has some, I'm not sure how he clarifies it, but it's clear in his writing that some unspecified yet significant correlation with a human being's self-making, which I think the emphasis on individual self-making really anticipates or like puts him in the camp of Enlightenment thinker, my personal take. And I go back to the historical method. Why do I think history of mentality or philology, to a large extent, encapsulate the essence of his approach, as Vico suggests, say, by examining the evolution of, say, the speeches in the Italian peninsula, we could reconstructively imagine the dominant concerns and the cultural or value orientation at any given moment, just by analyzing the, say, idioms, which are kind of relics of speeches, or the specific means through which the historical agents interacted and communicated. Because for him, social change in history is understandable only in relationship with the cultures or society's symbolism. And of course, we could not really travel across time and observe how people did things, but we still have access to a dominant medium of communication, namely language.
So, which is, I think, very much connected to what you said about the fantasia or the reconstructive imagination, that given the fact that Vico accepts that the relevance of the linguistic form, for instance, the form of communication for the determination of the structure of a culture, and following from that cultural evolution, how change happens in the context of the change in that linguistic structure, amongst other things, not just that, the symbolism and the meaning of symbols, or maybe even absence of symbols in the way that they exist in another period. We cannot go back, but we're still an insider. We can have that Einfühlen applied, that empathy applied, and also the scientific act will necessarily include that imagination. The scientific act is not just about looking at the relics. It's about reconstructing of what it means to, for instance, live in an era that the poetic language has dominance instead of the prosaic language, which is not the time that Vico is living in. So Vico can never know what it meant, how it felt truly to be a Greek and live in a shape of life, in a shape of Geist, if we are Hegelian here, that was primarily, dominantly poetic. But I think it's the same problem that you can never really know any other person. Empathy is not about knowing the facts in the sense of a series of facts that you can just know exactly what is going on, but it's about that imaginative force exists in a very simple act of empathy as well, that you have to be able to put yourself in the shoes of this other person as if it was you. And again, this goes back to the whole thing about the verum thing, which is verum is where we could say as if. We could imagine ourselves putting ourselves in the shoes of the Greeks, no matter how insufficient that inquiry ends up being in terms of its obvious limitations. But that relationship could be established, and that method requires the imagination. The imagination is not something to get rid of in a, for instance, Cartesian way, right? It's not, the images aren't bad thoughts. The imaginative force is a necessary condition for historical understanding, and therefore understanding of ourselves.
Yes, yes, that's great, because I missed one very important part on the role of history for Vico. That is, he established, I think, quite pretty much against the current of time, that history was not just a matter of rhetoric, was not just a matter of moral deduction. It was a legit self-sufficient science that would not only stand on its own, but also would fundamentally revolutionize the other scientific approaches, including philosophy in his time. As you said, against the Cartesian, all historical contingencies or cultural expression did not matter in a Cartesian method to search for the true thinking being. But for Vico, that's impossible. You cannot approach human self-understanding and thinking without considering the symbols they were using to make thinking possible.
Yes, although just to hint at a parallel here, which could be extended to other parts of Vico, and the parallel is with Hegel here, right? So the part that I did not really see in Vico, sure, to understand history matters. History gives us a sense of what it means to be a human being. And we could do this type of analysis that will give us a good picture of how many different ways we have been, right? What has been the domain of possibilities. But I don't see a rigorous attempt to connect this historical analysis to a final philosophical point, right? It is a historical assessment and it has a method, and that method is definitely not Cartesian, because that cannot even, the Cartesians could not even take history really seriously. But the way that I think Hegel, for instance, thinks about reconstruction of history, in some places, interestingly, similar to Vico, for instance, in his analysis of the poetic and prosaic languages, which could be a very interesting parallel between the two. But I think Hegel is getting somewhere with that historical analysis, that it's not about the study of history itself, but it's about the relevance of history, for instance, for understanding the nature of standards for action, right? How standards of actions really function. So this is not a criticism per se of Vico. This is just a difference that I think might matter. And it might turn into a criticism from a Cartesian perspective, that Vico, you did all of these things, right? And let's say you were right about all of it, but have you done anything, right? Have you done enough to really establish any truths? It's not immediately clear to me that if Vico is at least making it clear for us that where is he taking this, more than an interesting view on history. Like, is he looking for something more significant, or he just happens to be interested in the study of the historical periods, the linguistic structure of the Greek era, so on and so forth, right? Now, before we move on to the very important, maybe the most important Enlightenment problem, which is the problem of the relation between the universals and the particulars, I want to make another parallel clear that Berlin did not mention like immediately. I think Berlin actually mentioned the parallel between Vico and Marx, who apparently liked Vico a lot,
right?
In the concept of reification, that reification in Marx means that treating the man-made as a natural fact, that the order of, for instance, the feudal society, through propaganda, through all sorts of other means of communication, is presented as something that is a natural fact, just like the chemistry of brain is a natural fact, instead of something that is the creation of humanity, just like a joke is, or a history. So that was also interesting, but that's not the part that I want to focus on. I want to talk about Kant briefly, because Kant is, in a way, the embodiment of enlightenment in many ways. And I think for Kant also, we can, and Vico apparently is a counter-enlightenment figure. When we get to the universal particular, this might change, but our view might change about this. But Kant also, interestingly enough, has a very similar understanding of knowledge, in a way that, as he thinks that we can never experience anything unless we bring some concepts to the spatially temporally ordered intuitions, anything that we could experience possibly, and therefore know, in the theoretical domain and in the practical domain in a different way, we have contributed to its creation.
I see. That's fascinating.
So in that sense, I think for Kant, it gets to the next level in a strange way, that Kant would tell Vico that in the analysis of the chemistry of brain, you've been more active than you thought. If you didn't contribute the categories of understanding, you wouldn't have an understanding of the meaning of the chemistry of the brain. Now, I think Vico's response to that would be, that is not the contribution that I'm looking for. I'm talking about something more internal, something that I may contribute to what my perception actually is, but that's not what the kind of making that I'm talking about. The kind of making is more fundamental, which I think then we get to Kant's theory of morality, right? The morality, the domain of norms is us. The fact that the pawn is a pawn is nothing about the physics of the pawn. It's about this normative game that we can play. And because that's the game that we can play, the normative game, we have a more intimate connection to those norms than the laws of physics. But in both of these figures, no matter how much we agree on their connection and similarities, I think the same questions arise. For instance, the over-exaggerated independence of the natural facts and the norms. Now, in Vico's language, is the certum of certain natural facts and the verum of human-made factum, right? Is this independence, is this difference, is this opposition artificial? It seems that the border is established very rigidly. So is maybe agency, the difference between agency between a human agent and just the natural facts of existence in terms of, for instance, what the science of biology has to say about this. Again, Kant thinks that agency and norms, no biological fact could change anything about agency. It doesn't matter that these two are two separated territories. And of course, Vico does not talk about agency proper, but I think that idea that this is the game of the agents, this is the game of human agents, history is the game of human agents. Don't know how Vico wants to connect the territory that we can einführen, right? And the territory that we cannot. The relationship between the two seems to be a priori established,
precisely,
and it's not open to not only change, because Vico might say that okay, we could have a sense of how we could change this, but the distinction itself cannot vanish or reinterpret it with the resources that Vico gives us. You see, I think if we take away the verum certum distinction, then we have a problem there, and the problem is that okay, then what you want to work on? That seems to be an axiom of the system, and I'm not sure that that's a very, at least Vico does not give us a justification of the distinction.
I really like the point you just made. Vico basically presented the centum verum, which in my eyes is a good distinction, but as an axiom. And I have a problem with that. In reading his distinction there, I think there's a set of unspoken assumptions. First, there's a universality that makes cross-cultural understanding and communication not just possible, but it's a kind of a necessity. Like it's impossible for, perhaps in Vico's framework, to imagine a person from culture A would completely miss what culture B is at any historical given moment. But in my empirical observation, that happens all the time. But I still sympathize with his emphasis that there is such a possibility of communication. So I think universality is an unspoken part in his whole system. That, for instance, let's take his boundary between the natural environment and human realm as an example. Say if I'm an anthropologist, I can live with a tribe, whatever culture and become a member of them. But if I live with a group of chimpanzees for 5 years and interact with them through science, and I learn to interpret their emotions, do I become a member of that group of social animals as I do with another, like a human group? For Virum, that's impossible. The boundary between human and what is not human is a priori determined, and there's no way to surpass that. So I think, and also his whole scheme seems very, for instance, you mentioned the language. There was like a poetic, heroic age that move on to like prosaic, like metaphor, stuff like that. You can use that scheme for every single culture or language. They must, in my reading of his scheme, go through the same system. So if basically how a specific cultural system evolves, that it is predetermined, and cultural content or expressions vary, but that whole schematic trajectory, the moments of paradigm shifts are universal, are acultural. So in the sense that where to locate such cultural particularity, I think, is a point that I failed to find enough nuances or even just information about it in his system. Do you want to take that up and develop it?
Yeah, I think this is very interesting, especially the analogy of the chimps. I think is very interesting, and also you have mentioned this term before, and I'm going to use it, which you ended your point here with it, sort of, and that's the point of locating the contingency. Like, where does the contingency really stand? And this, I think, one line of thought that we both have pursued here is that this distinction is axiomatic, and this starting with such distinctions without prior justification, I think, is something that is gonna mature in Hegel's criticism of his predecessors in the post-Renaissance European thought, that with all sorts of they start with distinctions without justifying the distinctions. And I think Vico, with all the counter-Enlightenment emotions, falls for the same structural flaw in thinking. Now, someone could be pessimistic about beginning with something that is not an axiom, right? And there are thinkers of the 20th century and probably the 21st century that would say that it's all, you can never get rid of the axioms. The axioms are there. It's just like someone presents the axioms as the truth, and that becomes the means of power, and there's a power dynamic, and that you don't challenge them by going back to some non-axiomatic structure. You bring your axioms to the field, and then the fight will be the fight of the powers of the axioms, and everything becomes like this dynamic of resisting the unjustified axiomatic thinking of a system, right? It could be government, it could be market, it could be family, it could be university. Everything becomes something that is only there because of the axioms, and the axioms are nothing but the locus of power. Now, if we do not want to fall, which I will reserve this for later discussions where we talk about Hegel, but I think where we can locate Hegel in this discussion is that Vico and other counter-Enlightenment figures that we are going to talk about, and Enlightenment figures, are all the axiomatic thinkers. It doesn't matter how much they refuse or reject the other side, they still go back to a beginning that resembles this.
Right.
Even when they want to clarify those axioms, like Descartes doesn't want to start with axioms, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then later on, we can see that, okay, you are smuggling something, right? Kant doesn't say I'm starting from axioms, but like others would tell him that you are actually doing that. So we have that camp, and we have the camp of, oh, this is the fact that we are just going to start the power people, right? That the axioms are just there, and they are the pretenses. And I think Hegel would stay somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, like your middle path locating of Hegel, because I was thinking of the post-Enlightenment things, maybe in the camp of existentialism, like it's a radical rejection of any unquestioned embrace or acceptance of such socially constructed axioms. And but then it where how to say, make a sense of the mechanism through which individuals, if they're like truly autonomous, forms consensus about meanings assigned to symbols. I think it's a question really hard to deal with if you just fundamentally rejected any axioms. I like that locating, but I want to go back to the point, a comparison you made between Kant and Vico. As do you think we can compare like Kant's transcendental and immanent, that boundary, with verum and certum boundary?
So transcendental in Kant does not mean anything beyond, right? So the way that I understand what you're saying is that the verum is the immanence, is the domain that we are in, and the transcendence is the certum, that is a reality that is unknowable. I don't think that comparison stands, because first of all, the transcendental has a unique meaning in Kant in terms of like looking for the necessary conditions and so on and so forth. But if we are thinking about this as like some sort of a transcendence, like something that is always beyond us, right? The things themselves, something of that nature, and the domain of immanence that we can know and we can act in, I don't think Vico has that oppositional structure in his thinking. In a way, you're right in the sense that there is a way that we could have access to put it in more like Kantian language, the logic of norms, like making sense of norms. Then we can never have that access to the natural facts. But I'm not sure how much Vico wants to think of this as something absolutely transcendent, in the sense that Kant wants to think of as a domain that is just evading us completely. It's not that we have a partial knowledge of it. It's not that we cannot see it from inside. We cannot see it from outside either. And I think that's the difference. I think Vico would say that it's just, you can go take a look at your brain. That would be what for him what it is. Go take a look at the squirrel. You can never go live among chimps and be a chimp, right? You can never be a chimp from inside, and because of that, you can never have access to all sorts of experiences that a chimp has. But you can study the chimp, right? It is transcendent to an extent, but it's not escaping you. And I think for Kant, that transcendence is very rigid and very strict. It's not, you cannot conceptualize it. It evades categories. So it becomes meaningless to really talk about it positively.
Yeah. I don't know. I'm so ignorant on this, but I think one, the reason I brought up the comparison, I think they two share something quite interesting in my eyes, and they disagree in fundamental ways. I think they share the sense that their system to make sense of human world relationship is centered around epistemology or knowledge, because where centrum is a distinction in human knowledge. And So I think I'm not sure about the kinds of distinction between the transcendent and immanent is ultimately about the epistemology. I think the ontology is also there, is it? And do you see any ontology in Vico's system that he talked about making, but that making is really to be part of that things coming to be, not even coming to be, but like transforming to a certain extent.
Yeah, in that sense, if you're thinking about the ontology of it, I think for Kant, the norms are the domain of the verum, in the sense that norms are of our making. So to think of norms as the object of knowledge, we
Right.
have a connection to those norms in the way that we do not have connection to the mechanistic structure of the world. So to think about the laws of physics, we could think about them and we could make sense of them. But with norms, we are an insider. So there is a sense of furthermore immanence in that area. Like it's even more, we're more intimate there. But again, in all of these things, like maybe Kant would think of natural sciences as a sciences, as part of our co-creation as well, that Vico would have thought as being far more alien. But I think they are thinking of different things as aliens. That's what my point is.
I see.
Kant doesn't think that the object of physics are alien in the way that Vico thinks they are. I don't think Kant thinks that they're missing anything, right, from the chimps, the study of chimps in the whatever science of biology, or if we're missing anything about this stone because we can ourselves never be stones. I don't think he has any problem with that. Insofar as knowledge goes, we're done. We can know the objects of physics. The problem is that the physics, the domain of knowledge that we call physics, is dependent on the categories that are unique to human beings, and we cannot know how much of these categories are connected, relevant to the world itself. So this is a collective point. It's a relative objectivity, you see.
Right.
And I think this might be a good way to channel this to the point about universality and particularity, because we can think about universality and particularity in many different ways, in terms of like thinking about the particular more like an individual existence, and universal as like category, concept, all of those things, or kind, or anything of that nature. But in Vico, let me start saying something about Vico, and then maybe we can add Kant as well. What makes Vico a counter-Enlightenment figure? I think what Berlin is suggesting, that is his emphasis on history, on different cultures, on the particularities of these cultures.
Right.
Those become relevant for him. Unlike the standard Enlightenment thinking that is looking for a common denominator, human beings are rational, let's go and find the rational codes, right? Let's go find like what is useful, what is rational, whatever, for the rational beings. And Vico stands against those. Why? Because he thinks the particularities of the cultural shapes matter, the differences matter, the particularities matter, which is fine, and which is an interesting way to start distancing oneself from the universalities, dogmatic universalities the Enlightenment thinkers might hold. But that's the particular side of Vico, but he has a universal side, which is this method of like distancing himself and discovering the necessary patterns of cultures, the tempo of their evolution, an objective science of the cultural development of man, like having those incentives and interests and hopes and pursuits becomes very much contradictory to me. You can say that okay, for this inquiry, Vico has given us a concept, reconstructive imagination, right? That we need more than just simple observation, but we need to bring this into movement. But that's a universalist approach. You see, you're not thinking about the particularities as being absolutely distinct or impossible to bridge, impossible to connect.
Mm-hmm.
You are thinking of them as like kind of the same thing, right? There are different expressions of the same thing, and the expressions could be very different from one another, but at the core, they are the same thing. Not only that, but I could distance myself and look at this whole process and come up with some objective assessment of them, which I think what he thinks he's doing. Yeah, I don't think he's thinking that his assessment of the Greeks is anything subjective or like imaginary. No, he thinks that Greeks were actually what he is describing them to be. So one last thing that I will say, and then you can say what you think about this, is that for someone like Kant as this symbol of robust Enlightenment thinking, right? That's just someone in whom a lot of the Enlightenment ideals turn into a system, like a system that is very powerful. I think for someone like Kant, the universality makes sense only if you abstract from those particularities and go to the core directly, which takes us back to the whole Descartes-Vico problem, right? Kant is no Descartes, but I think Kant thinks that, look, if you're talking about if you're presupposing universality, let's delve into the universality then. Let's look at what universality is. Don't hide behind particularities and pretend there is some sort of a universal thread here. If there is a universal thread, let's make that explicit. And I think that would be a Kantian critique of Vico, that you pretend that you are for the particulars, then you jump on the wagon of universality without actually really telling us what this universality is about. And Kant would say, I will tell you what this universality is about. This universality is about agency, the essence of agency that you cannot deny from any culture. It doesn't need to be fully explicit, but the point is this level of self-consciousness, self-relation in relation to the other, and having a sense of that self-relation. And you can adopt that as reason, you can adopt that as agency, you can adopt that as the fact that we need norms in a way that chimps do not need them the same way, or they cannot become conscious of them, right? And I think Kant would say to Vico that, Vico, what you're saying is that they're basically normative creatures. And that's a very universalist approach. And you fall short of telling us what this normative essence really means. And you end up being an empirical historian that just conjures up some random facts and present them as the essence of some cultural spheres. Now, you, instead of doing that, come back to the warmth of the Enlightenment, come back to the club and be a true universalist. And you can do that if you think about the essence of norms and the whole story of Kant unfolds. All I'm saying here is that I think there is a legitimate counterattack from the side of Enlightenment to Vico. And in spite of the fact that I think the counter-Enlightenment people could also have a very legitimate criticism of the Enlightenment, right? But I don't think Vico is capable of really overcoming the problem, because he's a closeted Enlightenment thinker himself, from a perspective of someone like Kant.
Yeah, I very much agree with what you're saying. And I'm thinking how some radical empiricists would reject Vico. And I think that leads to the same thing as you said from Enlightenment perspective, that there is an unacknowledged universalist assumption that enables Vico to draw boundaries between cultures and use very limited aspect of a cultural system, namely, say, language, or maybe he also talks about art, to infer the whole ethos of the culture. How can you, it's like a linguist, a historical linguist says that by studying the symbolism, imagery in the language at given a specific moment, we can reconstruct what that society or that culture was all about in that moment. Art historian might disagree with that, saying the paradigm shift probably didn't happen at the same moment, stuff like that. So how do we get from very radically isolated, or isolatable at least, instance of speech acts to culture, which is an essentialized concept of identity? He just intuitively knows that the two correspond to each other. Yet the result is yet another very mechanistic view of a human history. Like the development is not a gradual process negotiated at each moment, but rather quantum leap across the different phases. So that's I think what a true empiricist would criticize. And also in the same vein, some comparativists would perhaps argue that, well, cultures are perhaps not that transparent or translatable as he envisions. That he, as a thinker in the Italian Enlightenment, he's Einfühlen or fantasia, positioning himself as a community of, say, medieval China. It was probably different from the medieval Chinese thinkers self-positioning as an Italian Enlightenment thinker. So there might be some asymmetry going on, which his system doesn't really provide that room of nuances. Yes, go back to you.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. That is exactly what it is. Like Vico seems like that he's stuck in the middle, that both the criticism from the Enlightenment side and both the criticism from the radical skeptics or empiricists in this sense, he cannot withstand either of them, because he has, and in that sense he's a fascinating figure, because he has the problems of both. Because the skepticism is also the question of like how far you want to go with the particularist view and the distinction and incommensurability and the absence of criterion, and couldn't that become self-destructive at the end of your own assessment? Because any skeptical assessment of the absence of universality in the study of culture, history, so on and so forth, is itself a universalistic analysis. That the essence of it is this axiom: I can stand above all the cultural elements, I can stand above all judgments and make this meta judgment that judgments are impossible. But a meta judgment is itself a judgment, and that's the trap, and that's then you will get caught up in another territory. So I think we could end with this note that Vico, being a counter-enlightenment figure, he's not, he has a very unique spot because he's not completely there. It's allegiance is confused, and despite the very interesting points that he brings out, his system does not seem to be fertile for further development. Concepts could be taken away from him, but the system itself seems to have some basic problems. I think when we start talking about the other Enlightenment figures that we're going to talk about, we're going to see whether Herder and Hamann could become or could be considered as a more representative or loyal figures of counter-enlightenment. Do they take this far enough, or do they come up with some alternative way of thinking that could be fertile in itself, not just through borrowing certain concepts, but as a way of thinking?
Yes. Also, my final remark is this conversation really brings this question to my mind: as is the Enlightenment a historic moment in the sense that ever since a figure like Kant, even you are a counter-Enlightenment thinker, you must deal with that universal particular distinction problem, in the sense that in my reading of most counter-Enlightenment thinkers, that category makes sense only in the Enlightenment framework. Did that make sense to you?
Yeah.
Okay.
So even if you want to say that the universal is nominal, right? The universal is empty, you have to recognize it as a category there, and that categorization and having the interest of delving into it, at least in the form that we see in these thinkers, is something that is at the core of the Enlightenment project.
Yeah, that's very interesting. It's like atheist versus or secular versus a religious concept. It's a definable or meaningful only insofar as that one is interested in the question of whether religion is intrinsic to
sure.
If
you're too involved in it, you cannot even formulate the formulation of the question. Does not matter. All right, I think this was a great conversation. Thank you, Trent.
Thank you, Aran, and dear listeners, stay tuned. Hamann is coming up next.
Cool. Take care.
Take care.